you. Okay, well I think then what we're going to do is we're going to turn over to our first speaker, Paul, and he's going to discuss a little bit about alternative approaches with a focus on organic and biodynamic. He's going to express what Southbrook, their approach is, pros and cons of this, and have a discussion with you. And we'll taste some wonderful wines. Thank you, Paul.
Thank you. Might as well, if you could, I think the Chardonnay's still in the fridge. We might as well fill it now. So if I could, I'm going to just do a quick background on Southbrook itself to contextualize why we decided to be organic biodynamic. I apologize for those who came here to see Anne Sperling. I was really hoping Anne Sperling would be here too. My own background, I am not the winemaker. My own background is in education and really in activism around high quality agriculture more generally through various means, including through slow food.
Would you like to do Paul?
Yeah, I'm going to do the first one. That's just a line drawing by Jack Diamond of our building. Southbrook is a third generation agricultural operation. This is just just going through the archives. Picture of Bill Redelmeyer Sr., so Bill's grandfather and his grandmother, who established the farms in Richmond Hill. Is there anybody here who's visited the farms in Richmond Hill? So started as a cattle and dairy operation, just run the biggest Jersey herd in Canada. And then as they wound down that part of the operation, Bill and his wife Marilyn had started a on-farm market, pumpkin patch, pick-your-own operation. And one day, Ian Hanna of Hanna and Sons walked in was one of their customers and said, you know, you guys are making wine here. You could be selling wine out the front door as well. And back in those days, this was the early 90s, 1991 was when we started. That's when the LCBO was closed as of 5 o'clock on Saturday night and didn't open until 10 o'clock till Monday morning. So the only place to buy wine in Richmond Hill, of course, until about, I think it was Christmas 1999 was the first Sunday opening of the LCBO. Up until that point, that was the only place to buy wine in Richmond Hill on a Sunday. So Bill and Marilyn started the winery in 1991, making this our 25th anniversary, our 25th vintage coming up. And the second, those cute guys in the other one there, some of you may recognize late of Lely Vineyard, currently of Carlo Vineyard, Derek Barnett, who's the original winemaker. Derek came to Southbrook originally to manage the dairy herd. He was an agriculturalist trained in England. So Bill is in the center, and that's Ernest, Bill's father. Bill and Derek kind of taught each other how to make wine, taught themselves how to make wine on the go. And Derek was the first winner of the Winemaker of the Year from outside of Niagara in the year 2000, based on the strength of the 97, 98, 99 reds that he had made from Niagara-on-the-Lake. So Southbrook has a long history of making exemplary rich Chardonnays and Bordelais reds. That's kind of what we do. In what year was it? It was 07 when they had one of the Bordeaux against Ontario tastings, when it was the Southbrook Poetica that bested Chateau Margaux in a blind tasting. So there's there's a gentleman from the LCBO up in Peterborough who styled himself as the little fat wino. And he did a number of those tastings and just putting aged Ontario Meritage blends against Bordeaux, and we would generally best wines that were 5 to 10 times more expensive than the wines than the Ontario wines. So, and I am convinced that the best red wines of Ontario are Meritage blends. You know, I think that's not an entirely popular point of view. And I think that in order for us to demonstrate that, we need to have age on the wines. So I have 2014 for you here, just to counteract that altogether. So the Redelmeyer family had been purchasing grapes from Niagara-on-the-Lake since 1991. In 2005, moved to Niagara. And in 2005 is when Anne Sperling came over. So I had worked with Anne Sperling at Malivoire from 2001 to 2005, and we both kind of left Malivoire around 2005 at that point. Anne, to me, is the most accomplished winemaker in the country. She started making wine in about '84 in Port Moody for the Pellers. She grew up in the Okanagan on a vineyard and is now making some wine under the Spurgeon label in the Okanagan. There were no enology courses in Canada at that point, so she studied food science at UBC and rode and played basketball and a couple other things as well. Because she's a competitor. She is a very, very fierce competitor. And she started going to workshops on organics and biodynamics in the 80s, when that was just starting to become part of the conversation in wine. And for her, it really harkened back to how her own grandfather had farmed. And because her grandfather, sometimes to the criticism of his neighbors, would let his animals graze through the vineyard in the off-season. He did not clean cultivate the whole vineyard. He would allow cover crops in the vineyard. Because his knowledge of farming was about soil retention, building topsoil, all those traditional farming methods. So as she started hearing about organic and biodynamic methods, she's like, this isn't weird. This is just kind of traditional farming, like my grandfather did. So, and I think for me, that's more and more the message about organic biodynamic. This is not a new innovative thing. This is logical, practical, traditional farming methods, sometimes put into a little bit more of a focus and a system, but it's not a radical new thing by any means. So Anne went on to start Cedar Creek in the Okanagan. Then she came to Niagara and worked on a few startups, including Malivoire. She was the original winemaker at Malivoire. And she now currently does consulting she's done consulting at many wineries in Prince Edward County in Niagara. And her and her husband now spend part of March and April in Argentina, in Mendoza, making wine under the Rosado label. So quite widely experienced and accomplished. She's also a noted wine judge, goes down to the California State Fair as a wine judge every year, and has done wine judging around the world. So to me, she combines that farming background, that tasting acumen, as well as she understands the science enough to know what she doesn't need to do in the wine. So a lot of what she'll do is she does send the wine out for testing, for lab testing, because what she wants to understand is that there is a nutrient desert in the wine, meaning that there's nothing that's going to re-ferment in that wine. That then allows her to use the minimal amounts of sulfite or zero sulfite, as in the second wine that we'll taste. So a lot of what I've learned from Anne through this. And my own interest, I've been in agriculture, so although I've generally been on the side of the business of turning it into cash after it's made, you know, I've always been, part of the story that we tell is the quality of the agriculture. So I've really benefited from working with Anne for a long time on this. So just where we are, Four-Mile Creek. Four-Mile Creek is the largest sub-appellation in Niagara. It's flat. You'll note that the grape varieties that are most common here, Cab Sauv, Merlot, Cab Franc. So it is the area where the Bordelaise varietals are mostly grown. You know, sub-appellations are, you know, no one's ever thrilled, you know, with how they end up. And it could be that this is too large of a sub-appellation. Arguably, the area here closer to the lake is different from further away from the lake. Close to the lake, we're getting more lake moderation. Perhaps one can grow Riesling and Pinot Noir up here. Where we are, which is right at the corner here of Airport Road and Niagara Stone Road, we're quite far set back from the lake. It's on heavy clay soil. We had worked for years with Kevin Watson, and when Bill asked about this site to Kevin Watson, he said, well, I would never buy it because I sell grapes by the ton, and I wouldn't be able to produce enough tons of grapes there because it's perfect for you. Because all you want is 2 tons an acre, and you can get your 2 tons an acre. We haven't quite hit those 2 tons an acre yet, but we're still working on it. So, you know, it's a heavy site, which means that the plant stays small and the production stays very low. So that allows us to produce Chardonnay with probably a little more breadth and richness than say on the bench or in the county. Not better or worse, but different. And then the Bordelaise varietals are the ones that we focus on. We didn't plant Pinot, we didn't plant Riesling. We like those grapes, we just don't think they're the right grapes for that site. And as I say, there may be other places in 4 Mile Creek that are successful, but not where we are so far away from the lake. That means what we get a lot of diurnal variation, so it heats up well. You know, we all love slopes when we talk about wine. North-facing slopes maybe aren't your friend though. And of course, most of the slopes in Niagara are north-facing slopes. And that just means that you get sun later in the day and you lose it earlier in the day. Being flat means that you're accumulating heat earlier in the day and holding on to it later in the day as well. The disadvantage of this site is the cold terminal temperatures in the winter. And so, our vineyards did get hammered the last couple of tough winters, despite the sleep deprivation of our vineyard manager, who was out there keeping the wind machines going and doing everything he possibly could to limit that damage. The last couple of winters overwhelmed with that technology. So 4 Mile Creek sub-appellation. If you haven't checked, this is all on the VQA website. There are really handy study guides if you want to deep dive into the various sub-appellations. Our planting itself, most of this is current. The Muscat, we were the first to grow Muscat Petit Grand. Now we know why nobody else ever did, because it didn't last very long. Made some good wine there for a couple of years, but they're gone. So when the property was purchased, it had been already partially planted in 2003 and 2004 by the previous owners. And so that's the plantings of 03-04. And then the building, we started building the building in 06. It opened in 08. I'll mention that in a moment. And then we've added to that some Syrah, some Semillon, which has performed well for us, some Petit Verdot, which has done surprisingly well for us. 2013 was the grape in our vineyard that accumulated the highest Brix levels, and it's really improved our top end Poetica Red. The 2012 is almost 30% Petit Verdot. And then we're really excited about this block, which we call the Witness Block. What we did here is we took cuttings from the original Cabernet Sauvignon plantings, which were 3 different high-quality clones from Bordeaux, and then we had them rooted here in Niagara, and then mixed them and planted them out here. So it's a Massal planting, so it's a mixed clonal planting that we think is going to give us the best expression of that site. And everything we did there was really in sync with the lunar cycles. So we think that's going to be our prime biodynamic achievement on the site. And then it's a practice we're going to use as we plant more. And we do have some Vidal originally for some. We make table wine, we make some dessert wine, and now we've been making a skin contact white wine. Our building, that's the building designed by Jack Diamond, Gold LEED certified. You know, we think that it's important that the building exemplifies what else we do. You know, I think the sustainability, and it's one way of expressing our goals around sustainability. So leadership in environmental and energy design is what LEED stands for. And of course, we weren't the first with the LEED building. Our neighbors down the road that you guys are going to go visit at Stratus have a gorgeous LEED certified building. We came along a little later. We were able to achieve a higher level of LEED certification, but that's really just because it gets easier over time because there's more technology and more knowledge that's available out there. But it's just one way of expressing what we do. So wine itself, or agriculture itself. So Organics to me has become over-identified with the avoidance of synthetic inputs. I think the avoidance of synthetic inputs is important, but there are a couple of other more important aspects. And one is that high-quality agriculture is solar powered, is dependent on solar energy. The true creation of common wealth happens when sunlight hits the photovoltaic cell of a leaf and creates food energy. Like at a really basic level, that's what quality agriculture is. And, and I think we can get too distracted by kind of keeping the temple of our bodies pure by keeping them chemical free. I think the real importance of what agriculture is that we're harnessing sunlight in the most efficient, effective way and converting that into food energy to feed people. And wine is just another food. We fetishize over it, we focus on it. In a way, wine is useful because wine is that first product that people cared about the quality of the agriculture. It's that one product where people said, well, if it comes from here, it's different than if it comes from here. And we're going to regulate that. And that's important. And I think, now we're going to I think it's important we translate that to all food. But it makes people care about it. Also, people have acknowledged that the quality of the agriculture is going to translate into the quality of the final product. Now, our dominant food system tries to convince us that an egg is an egg is an egg. They're all interchangeable. So, of course, if that's true, the only logical thing to do is to buy the cheapest one possible and have that race to the bottom based on economics. Yeah, the industrialization of our food, for sure. And and I think we're going to talk about sustainability. There are 3 parts of sustainability. There's social sustainability. We have to be able to pay our employees, and they have to have an environment and an economy that they can survive in. We have to be environmentally sustainable, but we have to be economically sustainable as well. And so economics is part of this. And of course, that's efficient. I'm taking something free and turning it into something of value. It's like the difference between a grass-fed and a corn-fed cow. Now, the grass-fed one is healthier for you, but it's also a more efficient. Like the corn is a petroleum-dependent crop, or a grass-fed cow is being fed by the sunshine.
However, your investment in the grass-fed cow is a lot longer. That's your investment in the grass-fed cow.
Yes.
Like you're talking about 16 months ready for consumption at a corn-fed cow, and up to 3 years, depending on where you are and the grass you're feeding the cow. So in my mind, the whole cycle is better because 3 years of life on pasture, like the exchange between the farmer and the animal farmed is a fairer one in my opinion. Because I think it's easy to argue that cows have actually been complicit in their relationship with humans. Like they're dependent on us for survival. But it's expensive. Nonetheless, notwithstanding the fact that the cow is eating sunlight, literally, in the form of grass, the care and the balancing is still an expensive thing from a farmer's standpoint, because whether you're holding wine in inventory for years to allow it to naturally mature, or you're holding a cow in a field 4 years, your inventory is big and tied up and must be carefully cared for. And that's the thing that people never talk about, and they don't want us to talk about, because that takes it from being a commodity, something that is ready in a year, it's here, it's gone, and all of a sudden it starts moving into something that's closer to the things we count as valuable. And I would argue that if we don't think food our food and our ability to produce food is not the most valuable endeavor that we have as a species, then we're severely off track. Sorry.
That's great.
Maggie told me don't get on your soapbox, but she's not here.
And we won't tell.
Okay.
And we're happy to have you. But anybody, please, if you have any comments, if brings up any ideas, please let's have a conversation. So the base meaning of organic, when Sir Alan Howard devised the term during the Second World War in response to the fact that farmers didn't have exclusive access to the nitrogen anymore, the chemical nitrogen, because they were making bombs out of it again, which is why nitrogen was originally isolated. So he was studying in India and studying areas where people had continuously cropped for 1,000 years on a farm site. He said, how did people do this? Well, they did it with cover crops, crop rotation, green manures, fallow periods. So not intensively growing the same 1 or 2 crops over and over, but with a cycle of crops and that cycle, a multi-year cycle, which would include pasture and pastured animals, which would then replenish the crops, replenish the soil. That's all about increasing organic matter in the soil. And organic matter is carbon. So when we think about climate smart farming, increasing organic matter means that we're taking carbon dioxide out of the atmosphere and sequestering it in the soil, fixing it in the soil. So high quality organic, and I would argue even more so biodynamic agriculture, is also a climate smart strategy for growing food. Certainly avoiding synthetic inputs is at the base of it. And we think of 2 things. One is avoiding synthetic fertilizers, nitrogen-based fertilizers. For high-quality wine production, it's not that bad because we're not looking to grow huge crops anyways. Having slightly starved soils is okay, but not spreading. When we do spread nitrogen-based fertilizers, they also give off a lot of nitrogen oxide. Nitrogen oxide is almost 300 times more powerful of a greenhouse gas than is carbon dioxide. So again, there's a climate benefit to not using synthetic fertilizers. And then the other synthetic inputs, of course, are the plant protectors or the sides, the herbicides, insecticides, and most importantly in wine, fungicides. Okay, so herbicides, of course, Roundup is the most widely used one, now acknowledged as a probable carcinogen by the World Health Organization, and becoming more controlled and banned in many jurisdictions. It also means if I'm spreading Roundup, I'm killing not just the macro plants, I'm killing all the small organisms, all the plant-based organisms that are living in the soil. Same thing with my fungicide. If I'm spraying a fungicide that is vascular or systemic, that goes through the system of the plant, number one, that ends up in your wine. 90% of French wines in the test that was done by, it's Anson. Her Twitter handle is New Bordeaux. Her last name is Anson, and she writes for Decanter. She's got a lot of great stuff on the use of pesticides in wine production. 90% of French wines tested with residue of systemic fungicides, or of pesticides full stop in them. But again, those fungicides are going into the soil, they're killing the native fungus in the soil. And then the same with insecticides. We really believe, and we've seen in our vineyards, but by having a healthy biosphere, we're keeping insects in check. We're not coming under undue insect pressure. Because we've got predatory insects, we've got birds in the vineyard, and so we can tolerate a little bit of damage, but it never becomes out of whack. So we're protecting biodiversity around the vineyard, but the most importantly is that biodiversity in the soil. The biodiversity we don't see in the soil is what connects the roots to the native minerals and nutrients in the soil and allows the grapevines to express the taste of place. So avoiding these inputs has a direct effect on wine quality. Questions about that? So biodynamics. Biodynamics, Rudolf Steiner is the inventor, a series of lectures done in the late 20s. And he was invited in. Rudolf Steiner's kind of interesting guy. Like invented a whole system of education that is still all over the world, the Waldorf schools, and invented a whole system of agriculture that's all over the world. Kind of an influential guy, you know. So he was invited in by a group of farmers in what is now Eastern Germany, and because they were noticing that since they had adopted the use of synthetic fertilizers, that their plants weren't as healthy, their animals weren't as healthy, and they felt their kids weren't as healthy. So, you know, what are we missing here? What are we losing by using these synthetic fertilizers rather than our traditional farming methods that we used to use? So he codified in a series of lectures what the proper response would be. So biodynamics, I like just to break down, like biodynamics starts by being organic. Before, we're ProCert certified. And we needed to be ProCert certified before we could go to Demeter and get certified for biodynamics. And we think certification is important. I think it's maybe something that we can talk more of. I think it's important partly because it helps to build the awareness, and also it means that it cuts out the back door, so that if you got a tough year and you're thinking, oh, maybe we should be spraying some synthetic fungicide. Well, you don't just have that back door, because you're committed, because you've already developed for 7 years to the point where you're certified organic. Do you want to like give that up and then have to wait 3 years before you're certified organic again? No, it ties your hands I think in a good way in order to be certified. So the 3 things that I say that set biodynamics in addition to organics are, number 1, whereas organic says what we can't use, biodynamics says there are a number of preparations we must use. And these are mostly compost, teas, and herbal teas. Some of which are applied to the soil to induce the microbiology. So not only do we avoid diminishing the microbiology, we induce better microbiology with these preparations. Some are applied to the leaves, so that you've got microbiological activity on the leaf that then prevents mildews and other microbes from taking place. And some are added to our compost itself to make the compost more bioactive, so that when we spread it, it adds more microbiology to the soil as well. Of course, the most famous one is horn manure. We all know about horn manure, right? They're cows. They're horns from cows, not bulls, raised in a biodynamic farm. You stuff them with manure before the winter solstice, and bury them on the winter solstice, and it stays under the ground for 6 months, absorbing earth energy. And when it comes out, it really has transformed. It's transformed from wet manure to almost crystalline matter. And then that matter is then dynamized in water by stirring it vigorously, and then sprayed on the vines in kind of homeopathic amounts. But it's homeopathic of microbiology, so that microbiology can then replicate itself. So that's one thing, is the preparations we must use.
Manually aerated?
There are some systems that have automatic stirrers, but it's generally thought that the human contact, because there is a spiritual element to this as well, and it's thought that having the humans involved in stirring it is part of the energetic force.
So how long is this stirring?
It's generally measured in hundreds, and it's like 100 one direction, 100 the other direction, because even it's believed that the vortex is important. If that's created, is important.
And then sprayed on right away, or does it sit?
That's generally sprayed on right away as soon as you dynamize it, for sure. And there is a biodynamic, we're part of the biodynamic group here in Ontario. We get together and make preps together. Everybody is invited to go out. You know, many gardeners do use them as well. And you know, and when Ann Sperling and Bill were setting up the winery, they said, you know, Ann said, well, are we going to be organic? As well, and Bill said, well, I wonder if we're going to go all the way to become biodynamic, and which suited Ann, because her experience was at Malivore, trying to be organic without biodynamics, was that it's really hard for plants to access nutrient without that microbiology. So especially if they've been chemically dependent through part of their life, and they've just been getting the synthetic fertilizers, in order to convert to the use of the more complex nutrients that are in the soil, you need that microbiology, because that's the glue that brings them together. And I think we understand that a lot with trees, that what happens there are fungus in the soil that get some sugar from the tree, and in exchange they allow the tree to pick up nutrients from the soil. So there's a symbiotic relationship between the roots and the fungus. And so it's some of that fungus that we're trying to induce through these methods. We also work with the lunar cycles. Again, to me, not a crazy idea. My mother-in-law tells me when to plant my lettuce seeds. And when I listen to her, they grow a lot better than when I don't. And she got the best garden anybody I know. And she just grew up on a farm, paying attention to where the moon was before she would plant. And this is just part of traditional farming knowledge in many farming communities that Steiner had then just kind of codified and put into the system. Works I can give you a couple of examples. One is, we understand that at a full moon, that moisture is, because of the gravitational force of the full moon, it moves the tides. That's also the high tide. So it's, you know, it's a lot, we can witness the effect of the full moon on the earth. We believe that it's pulling moisture out of the ground into the canopy, increasing our risk of having fungus. So to counteract that, we'll spray horsetail spray, which has a lot of silica in it, which brings light and heat energy into the canopy and counteracts that moisture, and then limits the danger of fungus. The other really practical use of this is that it's noted that at a new moon, the leaves at the bottom of a tank stay much more compact. So we bottle or rack at a new moon because we just get better yield. We get more liquid off before we get into the gunk at the bottom of the tank. So there's some really practical applications of this. Again, just traditional farming knowledge. And key to biodynamics is the integration of plants and animals into a self-sustaining system that limits the need for off-farm inputs. So, and one thing I really like about biodynamics is when you get your inspection, they go, okay, you're good, everything's good, how are you doing it better next year? And the goal is continual improvement, that every year we're getting better. So we started with a smaller herd of ewes. Well, we have 100 lambing ewes this winter, over the winter. So it's getting to be quite a large flock of ewes, most of which we had brought in a few, and we've developed that herd on farm. We do have now a couple of young farmers who are managing the livestock, and they're adding hog production and then chickens this year as well. So we're again expanding that use of animals on the farm. So that site that I showed you originally was about 75 acres, and we had purchased an additional 75 acres behind us. And that 75 acres is about 15 acres of bush, part of it which is where the hogs are running now, but also there's, that's where our pasture, hayfields, sheep are all kept as well. And then we bring them over for photo ops. And we graze them on the headlands and around the margins of the vineyards. I've heard people mention that they use them for leaf plucking. They must have like the smartest sheep on the planet. You know, I never quite figure out how that would work. And sheep aren't generally smart, so they're pretty, but they're not generally smart. So that's the other important part about biodynamics for us. So that's kind of that's an overview of it. Happy to answer more questions as we go along. Let's taste a couple of wines together, and then I think I'm excited by the selection of wine because we have some good complementary selections of wines. So the first wine. One of the students today said, "Oh, you have Whimsy wine," and we had at one point made a line of wines called Whimsy. We make our Triumph wines, which are generally, we think are kind of ready to go when they're released. They're more of our great everyday wines. We have had wines called the Connect organic wines, the most widely distributed organic VQA wines in the province. They're a generalist VQA, LCBO. We were selling about 3,000 cases a year of those wines each. And that's a wine that we're making with or other organic growers. As far as we know, we're the only ones buying certified organic fruit from another grower and making them into a certified organic wine. Well, let's talk about these wines as we go. So this is a state-grown small lot. All of the wines from this lineup are from our farm, are hand harvested, are not inoculated for fermentation, so wild fermentation. This one we happen to call wild ferment, but all of this line is our wild ferment or feral ferment. I think it's probably more accurate since not sure the yeast were there before we were there. I think it's a good illustration of the style of Chardonnay that we make on our estate, which is a little further south in Burgundy than Chablis. I think a lot of the Niagara style has that more limey Chablis quality, where I think we're moving a little bit further down that slope. In terms of our goal, anyways. So, are we doing like a guided tasting here, or are people making their own notes?
I think everybody's said that they are,
Cool.
good tasters, but perhaps Paul, you can highlight the aspects of the wine that you want people to know. That would be great.
Well, my wine teacher, my favorite wine teacher, was Jacques Moreno. And I always think of Jacques when I taste Chardonnay from Niagara, because he would always point out Bartlett pear. That was always his signifier for Niagara Chardonnays. And what I've really been enjoying the last couple of vintages, I think as these wines are starting to connect and express something unique, is a certain kind of fennel character to the wine. So to me, the herbal character in the wine is kind of a honey fennel kind of character that I feel is coming out, which gives it some of that savory depth to the wine. And this wine is absolutely dry, but it's pretty broad across the palate as well, as you'll find. And you'll see from the color, this is 20 months in oak, about 50% new. And all French oak in our white wine program, and we'll cycle through the odd high quality Missouri barrel in the red wine program, but the white wine program is all French oak. And she's tended to move towards more 300 liter formats, just to again minimize that oak content.
If there's any other winemaking treatments like malolactics, anything evident?
It's full mallow. What tends to happen with these wines is because they're not inoculated, is they go into the cooler weather carrying a little bit of residual, and then they kickstart in the spring to finish off. We don't stir. We have the oxy system, which allows us to put the bung in very firmly and then spin the barrel. So we're able to swirl the lees through the barrel without introducing any oxygen. one of the drawbacks of frequent batonnage is that you got to open that and beat a little bit of oxygen in. And so again, we're not using, we're introducing sulfite very late in the life of this wine. So limiting the oxygen is really important for us. So sulfites we didn't really talk about. In organic production, of course, we can use sulfites, but our total parts per million can only be 100 rather than 250 for conventional wines. So and we tend to keep quite low on that scale. So we're much less than half of conventional wines, and we're keeping even below that level as much as possible.
Well, in truth, when you say 100, that's 100 in total?
That's 100 total, yes, not free.
Rather than free. You would never in a wine like this see anything like that in free sulfur. Free sulfur you're going to get on the nose, right? As soon as you open it, it will often blow off. But once sulfur, free sulfur is bound, it does not act like sulfur anymore. And so those reactions that people typically have are the free sulfur not bound sulfur, which doesn't carry the same characteristics. However, what Paul's talking about in that trick to adding the sulfur is a real dance, timing it. You need to be very aware of the sun.
So any impressions, thoughts, protests? I think it's certainly, to me, broad across the mouth, but a nice sting of acidity, mineral, I think a lot of liveliness at the back of the palate to kind of keep it together. So it's kind of high wire winemaking in that way. And it's not a shy wine. And this is 2013. 2013, a relatively cool vintage in Niagara, right? And we did, in a lot of ways, 2013 is classic vintage.
Like 9.
Yeah, like 9, for sure. And so for the reds, it just means that it took them longer to come along. And the whites, a little bit more freshness, vivacity, great aromatics.
Well, for us, both of us, it's less of an issue when you're carrying a really large crop in a cool year, a cool but even year. It will show on the wines quite differently. I find that 9 and 13 were wonderful to work with, but I wasn't in a hurry for the wines, nor were the vines working particularly hard, or any harder than they were working in the other year.
Any questions about that one?
So just a simple question, what exactly is it, what is the name?
It is Estate Wild Ferment Chardonnay. So we did also, and did a few single and collective barrel studies in that year as well. So there is a Vosges barrel, there is a Moon barrel, which was coopered by the light of the proper moon, and there's an Allier barrel as well. So based on some different forests, she has some individual barrels as well. And she did the same with Cabernet Franc from the wine from the vineyard in 2013. So you'll see those coming out over time at the wine.
Well, I'll hand out the text sheets at the end of your.
Yes, great. You'll have text sheet. You'll have the complete information.
I have a question for you.
Please.
There was a study done at the Geisenheim Institute that talked about yields. Well, they farmed 6 acres of Riesling, 2 conventionally, 2 organic, and 2 biodynamic. They talked about the biodynamic vineyards having 10%, organic and biodynamic vineyards having 10% less yield than the conventional, but the worm population being a lot higher than biodynamic, like 100 times higher, or something like that, than the organic.
Interesting.
It was in Tom magazine recently. Anyway, they didn't go into the actual wine itself, is there any chemical difference between, that's consistent between conventional, organic, and biodynamic?
I don't have that. You know, I think we believe there's more extract in our in the wines generally. We've tried that in biodynamic, and that's a part of what I was saying. I started to say about Ann and Bill. It's like they had just been tasting wines that they thought had great extract, great longevity, great vivacity, and then realized that they were biodynamic, and that had been happening to them consistently over time. And you know, Zindumbrecht, not making too bad of wines. You know, I don't usually buy Chapoutier wines of a high enough price level to have the biodynamic ones, but they had a Crozes Hermitage that came out in a classics catalog recently, and said that's a Demeter certified wine. So like a lot of the ambitious growers are using biodynamic methods, but I don't have data on dry matter. I think that would be to me the measurable that one could do with those wines. Everything else being equal, what is the dry matter in the final wine?
That's something I'd be confused about. How exactly is that dry extract calculated? Is there a chemical process that?
I think they just boil off all the liquid. It's just they take a given volume of wine, boil off the liquid, and then weigh how many grams of dry matter are left over.
There was a question.
Another question?
I was just interested in the site and soil composition. Like you made a couple of references to Burgundy and how that's sort of the benchmark for Chardonnay.
For sure.
Where you are in Niagara would be substantially different, I would think, and I'm just wondering how that.
Well, they're heavy limestone clay soils. So with very fine limestone particle in it. We don't have chunks of limestone where we are. That's our neighbors out in Prince Edward County. But they're heavy clay soil, and Chardonnay tends to, in Burgundy, there's a lot of heavy clay soil as well. And I'm not saying our wines are Burgundy. I'm just saying that's more, our style is more of that. Now I have had wine writers say our wines are Burgundian, but they can say that.
Why would you want to? Anyway, why would you want to?
Yeah. I think it's just a point of reference. That is still, if you're trying to make great Chardonnay, you know, I don't think any of us is going, I want to make the next great Napa Valley Chardonnay.
No.
You know, it's like, for better or for worse, you know what I mean? Maybe our customers would rather we did, but, you know.
I just think that, and recently I was sort of at a round table of folks thinking about Ontario and that whole, how are we going to connect with Ontario and help them to have the same pride and passion in our wines that we do, right? And it's been a challenge. Like Prince Edward County's new, but Niagara has been there for quite some time now, and I think
for better or for worse, though, because for part of it means that we carry the baggage for the crappy wines that were made in the 80s, to a lot larger degree than Prince Edward County does.
Yeah, granted,
Yeah.
but you know what? If we were to blind taste wines in the LCBO, there is baggage from every country and every place.
Of course.
The problem is that here, Ontario generally is just continuing to carry that baggage in the face of tremendous excitement about the quality and safety of all our other foods, right? And VQA continues to enjoy a whopping, 7 or 8% market share, depending on how you want to count it, in one of the largest wine markets in the world. So we were sitting around saying, so what is it that is one of those barriers? These opportunities like these, I love. I don't think there are nearly enough. You folks are curious enough and excited enough about wine and Ontario wine to take time out of your weekend to come and spend hours thinking about it, I think the odds are good when you go away, the words that you heard are going to stay in your mind and are likely going to be part of conversations that you will have. So it's more powerful than the traditional wine tasting events where people are breezing by, I'll try the white. Where did you say you were from? But what we were thinking, and the reason I kind of jump back is that what we do as Canadians and Ontarians is we tend to compare ourselves. Are we good enough? Are we like this? It's like that. I catch myself doing it.
Do they like us?
All the time. Do they like us? Instead of owning, this is the Ontario style. This is our appellation system, and the world is going to be coming to find out how we do it. Because the truth is that what's happening in Ontario is some of the most advanced and innovative winemaking in the world, because we have challenging climate, and yes, so we're challenged all the time. We have challenging customers. We have to be better than the rest of the world. We have challenging weather. The climate
Well, to be
is
fair,
actually
our customers
great.
are spoiled for choice.
Yeah.
You know, if I'm an Argentinian wine drinker, I go to a store, I see Argentinian wine, probably some Chilean.
Yep.
You know, kind of similar style, right? But here we have wine from all over the world, all full stop, all time, and everybody wants to be in this market.
And they want the consumers talking.
Oh, for sure. And you know, there are, you know, not if we're going to talk about economics slightly, you know, there are about €1 billion a year spent into of subsidy that goes into the European agriculture generally, and a lot of that goes into wine. You know, when you see a winemaker touring the LCBOs in the fall, half of their travel costs are paid by the EU. Like there's a whole bunch of subsidies built into production, €1 billion.
Yes, and in Ontario we get about 15 million maybe.
Anyways.
Well, that was a good.
But I appreciate
it pretty hard.
I appreciate your point. I appreciate your point, and I guess I'm just thinking of if I'm a wine student and I'm trying to understand wine style, that you know, those are still the reference points for our wine style. But you're right. I'm not comparing our wines to this one.
I wasn't meaning to be disruptive.
It's good. It's good.
But also, aren't Ontario wines still fairly young in a way versus the rest of the world? That we're still trying to find our way with the varietals to some extent?
I think that's
I mean,
part
we're
of it.
still very experimental with a lot of the grapes.
You'll for sure see that when you get into my wines.
And then there's this whole trend, and I don't think we can talk about it with the wines you brought, but the one, I brought this up last class as well too, is why the Sauvignon Blanc varieties here in Canada are becoming more and more like Kim Crawford's. I have no idea. Why can't we do a Canadian, an Ontario Sauvignon Blanc and stick to it?
And I think that's the economic sustainability thing, right?
And designer yeast.
Yeah.
And designer
and
yeast.
picking
Yeast to make it taste like that.
Yeah.
Right? And there's a commercial pressure in order to do so.
Well, and you know this better than I do, but is the rest of the world, particularly the really big wine producing regions, not making wine deliberately to palates, to markets, right? And they're making them in vats that are beyond your imagination. People stand in the LCBO and they imagine those lovely wooden tanks.
No.
But in fact, there is an industrialization in the wine world that people never imagined, with tanks where 5 and 6 people are inside shoveling skins out.
Yeah. Go to any of the
I shove my daughter in my tanks. She's small, And she shovels the skids out. I tell her I had her deliberately for that
She's not
job.
child labor
Kept her
anymore.
small, no, she's big now, she's 28. We kept her from growing too much, just so she's still
Just on that, like, look up the McManus, not to pick on anybody, but look up the McManus wineries.
Yes.
Look at the pictures of McManus Winery, where it is huge outdoor tanks as far as you can see in every direction.
Yeah.
You know, there's a reason why that, you know, why that $20 cab is so consistent, because they come out of pretty big tanks.
Yeah, yeah. And I mean, they don't even bother putting the year on the bottles much anymore, because it's just.
It
close.
doesn't
It's just-
really matter.
Yeah, you're buying commodity at that point. Yeah.
Well, I would say that
Well,
this wine,
well,
this,
well,
I'm gonna use this wine to direct the conversation, the exact opposite way. This is the second vintage that we've made of an entirely no sulfite added wine. So this is, Anne's been experimenting around this. She did do some Chardonnay that she wasn't happy with where it went without sulfite. And so what she wanted to do was to use some whole cluster fermentation in order to build tannin into the wine as a preservative. And as you'll see, what I did controversially before we poured this is I shook the bottle, because to me this is kind of like Belgian beer. I think the dead yeast cells on the bottom are a flavor compound, and one can either decant off of it and waste a little bit at the end, or distribute it generally through, and everyone gets the same thing all the way through the wine. And I really like the effect of the lees in this wine. So this is like these are both organic biodynamic state-grown wines. This particular vintage, we just picked the grapes put them in a bin, had someone put boots on, tromped on the grapes to release enough juice to get the fermentation going, and let it go. So this is a 100% whole cluster fermentation.
What is the grape?
The grape is Vidal. We generally don't talk to grape, and I'm totally until people have tasted it, because I think it defies perhaps some of the expectations of Vidal. I'm happy to see some other kind of well-made Vidals coming out as well. I see Nicholas Pierce making a decent bottle of bubbles out of Vidal. This is, for one thing, trying to think of the model of Ribolla Gialla, of Friuli, of Cazzacatelli, of Georgia. Kind of like the unique local grape variety that is used to make the skin contact whites in Georgia and Friuli, and wanted to use, what's our bioregional grape? Also, it's a grape where the stems stay clean, where the stems on Chardonnay can look a little icky by the time we pick the grapes. Where here, the stems stay fairly clean and sound, so it allowed us to do that whole cluster fermentation. So all that happened, this was about 5 weeks of maceration with skins and stems. Because we didn't have to do any punching down, because of course you got the structure of the stems all the way through. It really helped us dissipate heat. It never really got that hot. It was a very kind of calm, gentle fermentation. It went through malo naturally during the alcoholic fermentation. So by the end of the 5 weeks, it was that nutrient desert that she's looking for. No residual sweetness, no malic. All the malic had been converted to lactic acids, so it was very stable. So we just pressed it, racked it 3 times, put it in a bottle, and thus you have it for you. And a wine that I'm really having a lot of fun with food and wine matching. When Afram Christine tried this, hadn't heard about orange wine before, but he paired it with like the Lys de Bourgogne, which I think that mushroomy quality really worked well with it. He paired it with Taleggio, paired it with some pretty big flavorful cheeses that matched it. And then I did an event with Gabrielle Hamilton of Prune Restaurant. She had a dish with chili butter and an egg and batarga. And batarga is a dried sausage made of a fish roe, and a pretty funky dish. I have no idea what the hell to do with that dish. But the orange wine worked with it really beautifully. So more adaptable as a food wine than I had been expecting from it.
What do you guys think?
Surprisingly dry.
Surprisingly dry.
Yes. Well, and I think it has all three parts of dry, right? It has which we don't usually get in white wine. It has the absence of sweetness, it has high acid, and it has tannin. It has the astringency as well. It certainly is a chewable wine. Should we do white and then do the reds in order, or?
We can, whatever, I'm easy, it probably would be easier for my sparkling to go. It actually would be beautiful after this.
Why don't we do bubbles next?
Okay. So we're going to switch over to you, Karen, for a bit, okay?
Okay.
We can tag team, it's all good. And I love that, and I also love the dissonance between the nose and the palate. Because there's that suggestion of sweetness on the nose, and that herbal character, and then it's just like, boom, it's just dead dry.
It was interesting when you brought up the comparison to a beer, because I'm of German descent, and when I first smelled this, I remembered Weizen.
Mm-hmm.
It smelled like a Weizen to me.
Yeah, well, partly the leaves, right?
Yeah.
It would give us that for sure. But I think also, like the guys at Bar Volo got really excited about this one because they're crazy for lambic wine,
Yeah.
and there is that wild fermentation character to this as well.
Paul, while I'm pouring this, can I ask a question on the business side?
Yeah, please.
When you were saying about that you were locked in to your certifications in tough years, you don't have the temptation to do something you shouldn't do. What can you do? What do you do when you have a tough year? What kind of things can you do?
Well, what do we need to do is more the question, I think. And, you know, fungus tends to be what makes us lose sleep as grape growers. And in those years where we've had fungus pressure, like 2013, to be honest, the chemically dependent guys, I refuse to call them conventional, the chemically dependent guys really did no better than we did. And we believe that by keeping on top of by having lower crop levels, by doing that hard hand work in the vineyards so that we've got good airflow, by using our biodynamic preps, and using sulfur, which we can use, using very small amounts of copper, which we can use, that we can keep on top of it, and that we don't really feel that we're at a disadvantage there. You know, I think fertility is one of those things that in the short term, there is sometimes a temptation to hit it with synthetic fertilizers if you want to increase your yield in the short term. And I know that certainly that's, won't call them out, but a couple of vineyards that had stopped being organic, which shall remain nameless, one of the first things that the corporate entities that owned those vineyards did, if that doesn't give it away too much, was go in and spread synthetic fertilizers because, you know, as any accountant can tell you, anybody can make money on the spreadsheet, right? Well, we're kind of breaking even at 2 tons an acre, so let's just adjust that cell to say 4 tons an acre, and then we're in the black. And how are we going to do that? You know, apply fertilizer. So, you know, I think it's that temptation more than from our point of view. Like we've had a problem with crown gall in our own vineyard, but there's no synthetic control for Crown Gall anyways. So it wouldn't have really been a difference for us if we had been using synthetic inputs.
Thank you for that.
I have something to add. We work organically, and we're certainly looking at biodynamic. Where we hold our own feet to the fire, and it's a tough road to hoe, as I discovered on May 23rd, 2015, was I made the decision early on that really, when I started planting grapes on my father's farm with 3 small kids, what I wanted to discover was that place, just that place. The world is full of wine and incredible winemakers, but this place was just my place. I grew up there, and I thought it could be interesting. We had grown a number of other things, including cattle. So where the decision that I made, which last year was the first time that it really, it actually caused all kinds of problems. And, but I decided that no matter what, we were only going to make wine from fruit we grew on the farm. And I raised my children in the middle of the 6 vineyards. I'm learning a lot today from the educator. I've made notes about, gee, Caroline, maybe one day you could make a PowerPoint presentation. And these are the things I really think that you should put on it, because it was very powerful, right? Because this farm that my father has been developing since I was a little girl is 600 acres. And when you see the map of where I am, and for me, in the same way that Anne comes from an agricultural background, until my daughter came along and grew up and started saying, why are you doing this? And I think we should do that. I never thought about it. I picked fields to plant grapes on because I thought they were good. That was the amount of thinking. But what I didn't articulate to myself or anyone else was there are reasons why you think what you think when you've woken up on and off for most of your life looking at a farm, understanding what happens when it grows, where the frost is, where the livestock have been, where they should move. And so and we have wind machines, and we also are at least 5 kilometers away from the lake. I love that for our farm. Niagara is just generally a little bit warmer than Prince Edward County, but where we are in Prince Edward County, we're quite a bit warmer than the county generally because we plateau, and I think you'll see it on the breads. But it's a bit of a heat sink. You pay for that heat sink the same way you do with increased frost risk. Last May 23rd, we had the coldest frost in 80 years. And I ran my wind machines, and my children were running the wind machines with me, and until about 4 in the morning, we were just barely holding our own. The road was negative 5.5, but we hadn't gone under negative 1.9, which was the dew point. Because it isn't just frost, but it's when are your leaves going to freeze. And it was a nice warm spring, and I had about 15 inches of leaves sitting there, but the grapes were just starting to form in the form of flowers. So until 4:15, we were holding our own, and then the farm did something I had never in my life seen it do. It froze from the top down. When the wind machines were no longer sufficient, my largest, warmest vineyards started to freeze, and over the next 75 minutes, I watched and felt, because I touched every leaf. I couldn't. We lost 110 tons in 70 minutes. I wouldn't have thought it was possible. And what we were looking at then was somewhere between an 85 and a 90% crop loss in a year where we were finally getting our feet under us and our sales were starting to climb. And I have been, for the last 4 or 5 months, making very difficult decisions about where those precious grapes that we were able to harvest are going to end up. Now, that being said, I always knew that choosing the model of estate-only production meant that the farm and the winery and our family were carrying all of the risk. There was no sort of offloading that risk. I've always built inventory. In fact, the low intervention natural winemaking came as a response, in my mind, to risk. I needed to look at the wines that were developing in the cellar in a different way. So I slowed the whole process down by allowing everything to progress naturally. It is not sufficient to say, well, I'm just not going to release conventional wines. Once they're on a certain track and you move them through a conventional fermentation and you're behaving in sort of conventional winemaking, what you're going to get is old wines if you're looking to carry an inventory rather than the typical sort of 1 to 3 years if you want to do it 24 to 60 months instead, because that allows you a diverse inventory that you then can play with as you move through. So this wine is the 2010. It's actually a brand new release for me. It came out just before Christmas. The white wine, the base, was made on September, it started fermenting on September 5th, 2010. So on the heels of the coldest incident on the farm in my memory, this wine was a result of the warmest incident on our farm in my memory. Because on September 5th, the Chardonnay was actually, I thought, a little beyond what I would have liked to pick it, except that I normally pick Chardonnay at the beginning of October, and I normally pick Chardonnay for sparkling sort of mid to end of the 3rd week in September. So it was a surprise, which is why I say all of my wines continue to be a surprise. We're 15 years in now, and I think Maggie will be well into, my daughter will be well into the winemaking before it won't all be new every year. So this has more Pinot than Chardonnay. It's 65% Pinot Noir because the only sort of tool in my toolkit to balance the acid would have been more Pinot, which was less ripe. So we had been up until 2010 sort of going 50-50 Chardonnay Pinot. The way I determine the blend is I split the crew. They go out, they pick all day, they bring it in, and we process it. Which means, you know, same number of people, basically. I get very little variation on crop load. So in theory, the crop should be coming in the same. It's usually fairly close. So I actually, rather than split the fruit, split the crew. 66% of the crew went out into the Pinot Noir and 33 stayed in the Chard. I'm not terribly scientific. I really came to science late in life and did go to school. I'm one of the only 5 graduating students from the Loyalist College Wine Technician Program, which was formed in the year 2000 as part of a cluster program. And while it may not, it actually did carry 4 semesters of viticulture, 4 semesters of Gen Chem, 2 organic chem, cell biology, microbiology, microfermenter processes. What it had that was different was it was a clustered program with environmental tech and nutraceutical. So we actually did a whole lot of work around ecology and around the environment. And I think fundamentally that, coupled with my background on the farm already, changed how I looked at farming grapes from the beginning. So I started out to farm grapes. I realized fairly shortly in that winemaking was going to become necessary. It was a little bit of a surprise. You know, I was just so, I can get very focused, and I was very focused on growing grapes initially. But I think to start looking at Prince Edward County and to start looking at sort of wines from my farm, this is a great place to start because it's driven by its minerality. But this is actually some of the most winemaking I ever do. So I started that fermentation. It was slow, it was cool. It took about 6 weeks to finish, but I aged the base wine in stainless for 2 years because it was really between 8 and 10 that I was wrapping myself, my head around slowing the process down. So I slowed the process of our traditional program down by slowing down the development of the base wine that goes into the. So after 2 years, or in 2012, just after vintage, we actually started the second fermentation. And we did prepare a base, but we used culture from our existing ongoing Chardonnay fermentation to move it along as well. So this wine then is the third release from that bottling. So this was on leaves, or in that process of second fermentation for, I'll count, 12, 18, 24 months. Third release. There'll be one more that'll be at 30 months.
Right? It's delicious.
It's pretty cool. I mean,
we call ourselves dry farmed.
yes.
It's kind of ironic because sometimes we wish we were a little drier.
Yeah. In fact, we pray we could be drier.
Yeah. And are you under drained?
No. So neither. No under draining and no irrigation.
See, we need to be under drained because where we are in Niagara on the Lake is where like 200 years ago they dug canals to drain the swamp. And when we get into the over beers with in the Niagara wine industry, it's the hillbillies on the hill or the hillbillies down in the swamp. We're the hillbillies down in the swamp. So it's heavy clay soil with very poor drainage. So we have weeping tiles down every single row, and we need to have done that.
I'm lucky. Hillier's first and best
Yeah.
crop is rocks.
Yeah.
And farmer beware. If you don't pick them before you start doing anything else, you will regret it because it tears equipment apart.
Yeah.
Most of the equipment I do use on the farm is reinforced because the soil actually, although it would be classified as a clay loam, it's actually clay gravel. And it is incredible to see it. I remember when in every vine that's on the farm, the one job that I did basically by myself was set them in the trough. So we had a planter come in so we could have nice straight rows because we couldn't plant a straight row if my life depended on it. My garden is a testament to that. So they were laser planted, but I did not believe for 1 minute that those two little plows that were pulling that heavy clay back over those plants could actually make sure there were no air pockets. And what I wanted to do was make sure they had the best possible start, because that's all they were going to get from me. After that, they were on their own. They had to figure it out. So, and this is the one time I'll get up, because this was really important. It was the year I quit going to the gym. I planted 10 acres in this super rough gravel, and I want you to think of rocks that are anywhere from sort of that size to the size of your fist, all piled together with clay in between. There's been a trough, these awful, delicate-looking little sticks with tiny waxed ends that carry the, the scion, which is the part of the vine that knows to be Pinot Noir. The bottom part knows, it's a Riparia clone, it's a Riparia rootstock, and what that does is protect the vinifera from the phylloxera that's in all of our soils, because North America is the birthplace and the home of phylloxera. It's traveled around the world, but it really belongs here. And the natural grapevines here are immune to it. Basically, they can become infected on their leaves, but their roots do not get eaten up by phylloxera. So in almost all vines in Ontario, and certainly in North America, are planted on on rootstock now that's some form of a Riparia-based clone. So anyway, they're delicate, they're about a foot long. You've got the little bit of the French ones, the ones that come from France, are, have a little bit more personality. They might have a bend, they've got different colored waxes. The German ones that I got when I got Riesling were all very, very perfect and very proper, and they were all exactly the same size, and they were all green. And they were very easy to deal with. And that's certainly been my experience with the plants as well. So what I did, once the planter was there, I went out and I had my boots on, and I started, and I felt with this little stick to make sure that it was all the way down at the bottom. And then I dragged some rocks in on both sides and stomped, and then I turned and I moved on to the next one. And I was doing that. I had about 12,000, maybe 13,000 to do. And I realized after the third day, I thought, it's going really super slow. If I do this math, I must still be doing this come August. Like, this is really bad. Except that around the fourth and the fifth day, I started to get faster, and a week in, it was going really quite fast. It was at that point that I realized that I was no longer carrying the 5 kilograms of clay on each of my boots that I was in the beginning, because you have this rough gravel, but then you have this incredibly sticky clay that as soon as it gets wet, just attaches itself to you and doesn't go away. So, was there a reason for that story?
That's why
Just because I needed a little break. I needed an exercise break. I'm used to sitting still for so long. Maybe we can pour the Cap Franc can go on. How are we for time?
We're doing okay. We can ask the floor if there's any questions.
More hard questions, please.
Well, actually, why don't we get a little bit to the way you make your livings and how you position the alternative practices that you do, because obviously it has to cost more or you get less yield, or for some reason, for the same amount of work, you probably need to sell your wines at a higher price. How do you, if we leave aside for a few minutes the fact that that it's VQA, how do you position the alternative practices who are your competitors? What's the pushback from the market, if any, that you have to overcome?
Do you want to start with that, or?
Well, I'm not sure I can speak to the marketing side of it. I think you're way farther down that road than we are. What I can speak to the costs, and I can speak to certainly what I've seen in market, and so my largest cost in the vineyard, or over 65% of the budget, is labor. And labor for us has gone up in the last 6 years, 30% by government mandate. And yet, it was 8 years in doing business with the LCBO before they tolerated a price increase. And the reason being, I think we saw an example of this week when the Premier released the news that we were going to be seeing wine in grocery stores, and that there was going to be a floor price on those wines of $10.95. I was shocked that people were upset that such a high floor price was being put on wine. In fact, I would have liked to have seen it a lot higher, because in order to compete in the market that's in Ontario, making wine from a brand new region, from an unknown farm, means that we have constantly had to operate very lean, very efficient, because there has never been any margin at all. In fact, sometimes I think if I hurried up the beef part of the project, it might be a good way to fund my wine hobby.
Well, it makes me think of Mission Hill.
Exactly.
Who, of course, financed that whole business on the basis of Mike's Hard Lemonade, right? And on Mandels, I have to really admire them. They've now spun off Mike's Hard Lemonade, and you know, that's really allowed them to increase their quality wine production a lot. For us, certainly, it's part of our market differentiation. That is true. For the Connect wines, our deal with grape growers is that we will pay a 10% premium over the commodity price of fruit for transitional fruit, and then we'll pay 20% per ton for certified organic fruit. Now, when you think of what the contribution to the cost of goods is of the fruit itself, that's not a huge amount. But in the marketplace, we were able to launch those wines at what was then the top end, which was $14.95 for VQA wine.
It really was the top end.
That was as high as you were allowed to charge in the general list for VQA wine. And arguably, that should be the bottom price. Because when you extrapolate from the price per ton of grapes at the commodity price, excluding maybe hybrids, but for vinifera grapes, really you're at $15 a bottle, you're just breaking even when you're selling through the LCBO. Out your farm gate, you're capturing a little bit more margin, so you have something more to play with. For us with the Connect wines, we very quickly went from that $14.95 to $15.95, and then when it became clear that we were short on the red, we took that to $17.95. It didn't slow down our sales at all, because by that point we had developed loyalty with our customers. The target that you have to kind of meet in that basic price point is about 1,000 cases a year. So we were at 300 times our target, or 300% of our target, 3 times our target. So, you know, we think being distinguished by organic was a part of that. Now, of course, we spent money on some promotions, we tweaked the label partway through, which we believe had, you know, like, and all these things are practical considerations that do motivate people to buy it. You know, it took me a while to accept it through, you know, kind of through gritted teeth. You know, I'm kind of a, it's what's inside that counts kind of guy, but that's not how the average consumer is motivated when they're standing in front of that sea of bottles and they have to pick one. And, you know, people in the wine store, I think they're really, it's all about risk mitigation. It's all about certainty. It reminds me of someone from the industry whose family owns an Ontario winery. And she was in her late 20s, and she had a party with her friends. She said, "Bring a good bottle of wine." She said, 12 out of 12 people showed up with California Cabernet.
No.
Yeah, 12 out of 12. And that's risk mitigation. That's, well, I'm confident it's going to be good if it's California Cabernet.
Nobody will judge me.
Yeah, exactly. No one's going to look down on me if I choose that. You know, and you know, and the limited price points on the general list don't do us any favors. It's like, I know French wines are good because if I only go into the general list, which describes still a lot of consumers, I can see a Chateauneuf de Pape at $30 from France, and I know California wines are good because I can find a $30 California wine on the general list. And I know that Ontario wines must be crap. Because they're, none of them are worth more than $15, so how good could they be?
Yeah.
Right? And so it really plays into the
And
consumer
it's the
perception.
chicken and egg,
Yeah.
because the LCBO is afraid to let the
Yeah.
price point move up.
Yet at the same time, you seem to be able to sell all of your production.
Yeah,
Yeah,
Yeah.
okay.
Yeah. You know, do we wish we could sell our premium bottles more quickly and with less effort? 100%.
So the challenge is at what price then?
For sure.
In both cases?
For sure. Because for us, we also have a Vintages Essential Triomphe Cabernet Sauvignon. So the only VQA Cab Sauv on the vintage in Vintages. And it's always just performed slightly below the target. But as the buyer says, it's not as if I have an alternative. You know, and so there, the organic status is an important differentiator.
just like the Prince Edward County.
Just like Prince Edward County is your important differentiator.
And in my case, I would plant more vineyards, except that I think I've sort of found the sweet spot in our distribution. So in the absence of a change in consumer habits or a change in market access that's reasonable and useful to me, I'm not interested in playing a race to the bottom. I have found a very fine balance here that will sustain the people who work on the farm, that will allow us to continue to seek the quality that can come out of the fields, look for biodiversity, play around with how the goal, my daughter and my goal for the next 10 years is to see how close to zero inputs on the farm we can actually get. Well, you said we'll see how that goes,
But at the outset, it seems to me that it's from respectively your passion for that alternative type of agriculture first.
absolutely.
Then we'll sell it however we can.
Yeah, I don't think there is any corporate entity that would look at the amount of work, the amount of preparation, the amount of sacrifice that has to go into this and say, wow, that makes sense.
The accountants aren't your allies.
No, and I've been told over and over again, well, couldn't you just grow more? Couldn't you just, like, other farms get higher yields. And this, just before Christmas, someone said to me, because I was saying that one of the wines that I usually make, I wouldn't be producing in the next year. They said, well, why don't you just go and buy some wine? And I said, well, because
Just like the most successful winery of Prince Edward County?
yeah, exactly. And I said, because for me, raising my kids here and doing this, it's actually my word. You know, I can't even think now how many people I have said the words, I'm only gonna make wine from the fruit that I grow on my farm. So is it only that except I only do it when it's easy to do, and then I don't do it when it's really super hard.
Do you want to take us through your
The last one, the
Yeah.
Cab Franc. So this is, again, from 2010, exact same winemaking. 28 days on the skins. This was pumped over a little bit more. What I'm looking for is giving the grapes as much of an opportunity as possible to release the grape skins, to release their tannins into the wine, because that's really the only tannin that I'm ever going to have to work with. Other than that, both the Pinot and the Cab Franc had very, very similar elevages. So now you can see the difference that the variety brings to the process. I also grow the Cab Franc on the hottest spot on the farm. It was actually the first to go when the frost hit, because it's right at the top of the plateau. So there will be no 2015 Cab Franc. But I'm just working with the 2012 right now, so I won't feel that crunch for a while. And hopefully by then I'll have had an opportunity to sort of move through the other vintages and get back into a rhythm. It's a little more challenging with the whites. But we do a Pinot Gris. I have 8 acres of Pinot Gris, and we do Pinot Gris with skin contact. Not
No stems, yeah.
no stems, although I'm very
Oh, do a barrel this year.
well. I think Maggie wants to. We do between 15 and 24 hours of skin contact. So our Pinot Gris is the antithesis of what you think of when you think Pinot Grigio. It's colored. It ranges anywhere from apricot to pink. I once had someone return a bottle of my Pinot Gris because they said they didn't want rosé. I said, well, I get that, but it's not. It's just Pinot Gris with 15 hours of skin contact. But this it's interesting to me because really both Prince Edward County and Niagara are very interesting for Cab Franc. And they really, really impart their terroir strongly into it. It's easy to smell the difference between Niagara and Prince Edward County. And I love to have Cab Francs from other places because really Ontario Cab Franc is beautiful, beautiful. It is a great, great grape for Ontario. It makes a really nicely balanced wine, a little softer on the acidity, not quite as in your face as Pinot Noir.
Very food friendly.
Yeah, it shows the benefits of some patience as well.
Yeah.
Yes.
Because
That
it's wine
is,
that's living beautiful.
yeah. I confess I haven't been spinning.
Yes, well, I wasn't patient till I started this either. I still don't think it's my face opposite the word conventional.
Okay, is there any questions from the floor to our fantastic two wineries here today?
What is the retail of the front?
That one is $35.
Really? Wow.
Well, it's a small lot.
No, I was at another Niagara Bench winery on Holiday Monday, and they were flogging a Cabernet Franc that's $110 a bottle, and I kind of went, excuse me.
Oh, I thought you were saying it was too expensive.
No, I would put that against that in a heartbeat.
I have a question, that's sort of a broader question. And if, and I think you might both agree that conventional chemical agriculture is not sustainable. Is any agriculture sustainable today? Like,
Absolutely.
Is organic and biodynamic sustainable if the entire world went to it?
Yes, and I think there's a lot there's I was speaking to a fruit farmer today who's transitioning towards organics, and he had just come back from a couple of conferences and goes, "Guys, those are pesticide conferences," and like he was just the power of the pesticide companies. And there's certainly a lot of university professors who are connected to that system who will tell you that organics can't, or organics are practical, cannot feed the world. I would argue that a style of agriculture that results in at the end of the season there being more topsoil, healthier environment, cleaner water, better air quality is the sustainable model. And conventional agriculture has degraded, just think of topsoil, has degraded our topsoil to such a great extent over the last 100 years. That's what's unsustainable. And it's not just about feeding the 9 billion people in 2050. It's like we have a responsibility to have an agriculture that in 10,000 years we can feed the population of the earth. And the only way to do that is to have these methods that build topsoil every year, that lead to a healthier environment every year. Like, in a lot of ways, wine doesn't matter. It's like, how are we going to grow potatoes? How are we going to grow the foodstuffs that we need to live on? And and animals, a strict vegan will look at farming and say, well, if you take a given amount of land and all you grow is plants, and you feed plants directly to humans, that's more efficient. The weakness of that argument is that there's a lot of land that doesn't suit small crop production or seed production. What it does suit is pasture. And pasture is a really efficient way of converting sunlight into protein that can be fed to humans. And so, yes, I think that clearly that it's practical. And there's just follow the news. There is some good there are some good reports that continue to come out about the sustainability of it. And I just put if and around genetically modified foods, I would just say look up the study called Failure to Yield.